The world ended quietly, not with fire, but with a slow bloom of pale spores drifting across a forgotten sky. 20 years have passed since the fall of 2013, since cordyceps rewrote the fate of humankind. I am only a narrator now, sifting through the remnants, the journals, the broken maps, the whispers of those who tried to survive. Joel and Ellie move through these memories, like two fading silhouettes pushing against a collapsing world. So, lie back, breathe slowly, and let me guide you through what remains of humanity's last echo. If you enjoy these journeys, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is, and the topics you'd love to explore. Your thoughts may guide our next adventure. When I look back through the fractured records of this world, I always find the story settling into three silhouettes: Joel, Ellie, and Abby. Their lives do not run parallel. They intersect, collide, and echo one another across the long, ruin-stained timeline from 2013 to 2039. To understand the world of cordyceps, I must begin with them, not as heroes or villains, but as three gravitational centers shaping the moral landscape around them. Joel Miller enters the archive as a man split in half on Outbreak Day. Losing Sarah did not simply wound him, it hollowed him, leaving a body that still moved and breathed while something essential dimmed inside. For 20 years, he drifted through the smuggling underworld, making choices sharpened by fear and necessity. Morality, for him, became a fading compass. But in 2033, escorting a young girl who reminded him of everything he'd lost, something long buried stirred again. That journey with Ellie across Colorado's snowfields, cannibal towns, abandoned campuses, became the slow resuscitation of his humanity. And in Salt Lake City, when he saw Ellie unconscious on an operating table, he chose love over the world. His decision shattered the Fireflies and split the fate of the entire timeline. His lie at the end of Part 1, meant to protect her, became the quiet tectonic shift that set the next 4 years on a collision course. Ellie Williams moves through these records like a paradox, a child immune to cordyceps, yet deeply vulnerable to the weight of expectation. After Riley's death, after learning she alone could stop the infection, survivor's guilt wrapped itself around her identity like a second skin. She carried the terrible belief that she should have died for something bigger. Joel's love gave her warmth, but his lie gave her fracture. By the time he was killed in Jackson in 2038, the world inside her collapsed into a spiral of rage, grief, and desperate purpose. Seattle became the stage for her descent, every choice sharpening her edges, every step blurring the line between revenge and self-erasure. And when she finally stood over Abby on that empty beach in Santa Barbara, she realized the truth: vengeance cannot resurrect the dead, it only multiplies grief. Her release, quiet and trembling, was not forgiveness, it was survival. Abby Anderson is the final shadow in this trinity, shaped by another wound, the death of her father, the surgeon Joel killed to save Ellie. Her life from 2034 onward became an obsession carved into muscle and discipline. But vengeance does not grant peace, it only feeds itself. After killing Joel, Abby's story twists in a direction she never anticipated. The bond with Lev, the fragile threads of empathy, rekindled through protecting someone smaller, softer, and in need. She becomes Ellie's mirror, not her opposite. Two young women sculpted by loss, each blinded by purpose, each slowly rediscovering what it means to save instead of destroy. In the end, All three of them teach the same truth. No one in this world is righteous. There are only people trying to live with the weight of what survival demands. When I walk through what remains of America's cities, I don't feel as though I'm moving through streets. It feels more like drifting through the ribs of a giant creature, long dead, its bones softened by moss and quiet time. 20 years after the fall, the cities have stopped pretending to be places built by humans. They have surrendered themselves to something older, slower, and far more patient. The neighborhoods are the first to greet me. Rows of homes once filled with warm lights and late dinners, now they lie under blankets of green. Grass pushes through cracks in the pavement, threading itself into the seams of collapsed porches. Cordyceps climbs the sides of buildings like a second skin, curling around banisters, swallowing billboards, and spilling over balconies. If you listen carefully, very carefully, you can almost hear the soft, fibrous breath of the fungus working its way through wood and steel. It isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It is simply everywhere. In the downtown cores, the silence grows deeper. Skyscrapers tilt slightly toward each other, as if whispering secrets about the world that vanished overnight. Some towers lean so precariously that their broken silhouettes seem frozen mid-collapse, suspended in a moment of hesitation that has lasted for decades. Others sag inward, where the fungus burrowed through steel, eating the support structures until the buildings became hollow husks. When the wind blows, the bones of the city groan softly, steel beams shifting, shattered windows trembling, almost like a creature exhaling in its sleep. There are moments when I step into these places and feel as though the entire skyline is holding its breath, as if something immense is about to wake up, but nothing ever does. The highways tell the rest of the story. Once designed for speed and movement, they now resemble dried riverbeds. Sections of road have collapsed into muddy basins filled with rainwater, forming accidental ponds where reeds sway gently in the breeze. Cars, rust-eaten and softened by time, sit piled in permanent traffic jams, their frames clenched together like fossilized insects caught in amber. Street signs swing lazily from rusted hinges, tapping lightly against their poles with every gust of wind, as though signaling to travelers who no longer exist. Even the traffic lights, once symbols of order, hang dark and broken, their glass smashed long ago. Sometimes, when the sun hits just right, the shards still catch the light, scattering faint glimmers across the road. These are the closest things to stars the city remembers. And yet, despite all the ruin, the silence here feels strangely tender, not hostile, just empty, in a way that makes you breathe softer, as if not to disturb what little peace remains. Every street, every toppled storefront, every half-collapsed apartment has become a kind of time capsule, a still photograph of the apocalypse, left hanging in the air for 20 years. This is the first layer of the Last of Us world, a civilization paused mid-sentence, gently reclaimed by nature and softly hollowed by the passage of time. When I step toward the borders of a quarantine zone, I can always feel the shift, not in the air, but in the way the world seems to tense. The wilderness outside is open and silent, but the moment the steel walls rise into view, everything tightens, as if the city is clenching its teeth. Fedra designed these places to be havens, but after 20 years, they feel more like exhausted fortresses, trying to hold back a tide that has already swallowed the world. The perimeter is unmistakable, Thick metal walls, patched with mismatched plates, reinforced by humming electric fences that crackle faintly in the wind. Floodlights remain mounted on rusted towers, though most no longer work. At every entry gate, a line of scanners sits beneath worn tarps, machines meant to read barcodes, documents, wrist stamps, any proof at all that you belong inside. Everyone who approaches must stand under the cold stare of a soldier while a handheld device presses against their neck, searching for infection. These tests are quick, clinical, and practiced, and yet they never feel routine. The slightest tremor in a soldier's voice can send an entire line into panic. Inside the QZ, the mornings begin with the same ritual. Loudspeakers crackle awake, spitting out grainy announcements, curfew updates, work assignments, ration schedules. The voice is always calm, always steady, but the message it carries is one of control, a reminder that safety here depends on obedience. In these narrow streets, people survive because Fedra allows them to, or at least that is what the system tries to make them believe. Life inside is a careful balancing act. Food is scarce, water rationed, medicine nearly mythical. Every distribution day becomes a slow-moving parade of tired faces waiting for a number to be called, hoping their portion hasn't been cut again. Tension is the true currency of the QZ. It hangs in the air as thick as the dust drifting between cracked windows. During the day, arguments break out in breadlines, and whispers dart through the alleys like small frightened animals. At night, the soundscape changes. A single gunshot echoing across rooftops tells the story of someone discovered too late or removed too quietly. Black markets bloom in the corners. Fedra can't reach, tucked behind torn curtains, beneath abandoned loading docks, inside old laundromats. Here, a bottle of antibiotics can be worth more than loyalty. A handful of bullets can buy a month of favors. People don't barter because they're greedy. They barter because survival here requires creativity that the system refuses to acknowledge. The architecture inside the walls offers a final, quiet commentary. Old apartments, once filled with separate families, now house dozens, each room partitioned with blankets, furniture, whatever can create the illusion of privacy. Police stations, schools, and clinics have been repurposed into command posts, barracks, or storage depots. These buildings look as though they're standing out of habit rather than strength, tired structures propped up by the simple fact that nothing better exists to replace them. In the soft morning light, these spaces resemble relics of a life that almost continued, and yet, when you look closer, you see what Fedra truly built, not sanctuaries, but cages, fragile shelters held together by fear, routine, and the desperate hope that tomorrow will not be worse than today. Beyond the last electric fence of any quarantine zone lies a world that no longer remembers it once belonged to us. The wilderness has reclaimed the highways first. The asphalt is cracked, buckled, and stitched together by pale birch trees that rise straight from the old rest stops like white pillars. Their leaves whisper softly in the wind, brushing against street signs that no longer point anywhere. Nature is not rebuilding. It is simply moving forward, indifferent to what once stood here. Animals walk these roads more confidently than people ever did. Hares dart between collapsed guardrails. Deer graze in the shade of abandoned billboards. And every so often, a massive shadow moves through the fog. A zoo escapee still wandering decades after its enclosure fell apart. These creatures have made the land their own, stepping over rusted vehicles and crumbled concrete with a grace humans never managed. But beauty here is fragile. Behind that serenity waits the other half of the wilderness. The traps, the lawless ambushes, the blood-stained remains of groups who tried to build empires out of desperation. A single step off the main road might set off a crude mine or send a traveler tumbling into a pit lined with broken glass. Even the living forests have learned to hide danger. And then there is the fungus. Cordyceps does not simply inhabit structures, it constructs them. I have walked through buildings where entire hallways have been transformed into soft, pulsing tunnels. Thick mats of fungal growth spread across walls, floors, and ceilings like blankets of breathing concrete. In the quiet, you can hear it, tiny, delicate cracks, the sound of fibers tightening, shifting, growing. The fungus is patient. It shapes its environment, not with force, but by consuming everything slowly: wood, steel, flesh. Some areas are entirely overtaken. The original architecture is buried beneath layers of hardened fungal plates, each segment curling upward like scales on the back of some ancient creature. Sunlight filtering through broken windows glints across the pale surface, making it look less like mold and more like armor. When you walk through these places, the world seems to hold still, as if you are trespassing inside the shell of something sleeping. But the true terror resides in the spore zones. These spaces hide in basements, storage rooms, underground parking garages, any place where the air cannot move freely. Step inside, and the light of your flashlight reveals clouds of golden dust suspended in the darkness. They drift gently, like pollen, beautiful, in a way that is almost cruel. A single breath inside without protection can end a life, and yet the infected stand here motionless, fused into the walls, their bodies anchored in thick growths of cordyceps. Some have no face left, others retain the faint outline of a human jaw. They are held upright by the fungus that consumed them, like grotesque statues honoring a kingdom that never wanted them alive in the first place. This is the wild world outside the walls, a land neither dead nor alive, echoing with nature's renewal and the fungus's quiet dominion, a place where humanity survives only as long as the wilderness allows it. When you wander long enough through the wastelands, you start to understand that not all dangers wear fungal growths or echo click through abandoned malls. Some dangers carry rifles, march in formation, and speak in the clipped, hollow authority of systems trying to survive by force. In the years after the outbreak, two such systems rose to prominence: FIDRA and the WLF. Both were born from desperation, and both reshaped the land with their own brand of order. FEDRA, the skeletal remains of what once was the US government, clung to power through fear. Their philosophy was carved into every steel checkpoint and every shouted curfew: security first, humanity later. I remember walking past their outposts, watching soldiers in worn combat gear scan trembling civilians with handheld devices. The tests were quick, but the silence afterward was longer. One beep, too many, one nervous twitch, one reading too high, and a life ended on the spot. Their executions were not personal, they were procedural, part of a system designed to prevent collapse by becoming its own form of violence. Inside FEDRA's quarantine zones, life followed a strict rhythm. Loudspeakers recited regulations, like lullabies of oppression. Patrols marched at predictable intervals, their boots hitting the concrete with mechanical precision. These zones were the last bastions of civilization, yet they felt more like exhausted strongholds, places barely held together by routine and threat. People survived here because Fedra enforced survival, but the cost was slowly, quietly carving away at their spirit. Every rule was a reminder. Order was maintained not by trust, but by control. And far to the west, in Seattle, another power rose to meet them, the WLF, or the Wolves. They began as rebels fighting Fedra's iron grip, but revolutions often mirror the systems they overthrow. When the Wolves took control of the city, they built something worse, a machine of discipline, military precision, and relentless loyalty. Their motto whispered through every training yard and every armored patrol: for us to live, the enemy must disappear. Unlike Fedra, the Wolves did not pretend to preserve a country. They wanted territory, dominance, and absolute unity. They maintained stockpiles of weapons, trained relentlessly, and patrolled with a confidence born of numbers and firepower. Their caravans rumbled through the streets like thunder, armored trucks, mounted gunmen, soldiers who looked at you not with fear, but with determination. They were efficient, brutal, certain, but their efficiency came with a cost. The endless grinding war with the Seraphites hardened them into something cold, something single-minded. In fighting a fanatical enemy, the Wolves became a reflection of the force they once resisted. Discipline turned to rigidity, protection turned to conquest, community turned to militarized obedience. Moving through the territories controlled by Fedra or the Wolves feels strangely similar. The insignias change, the slogans shift, the faces behind the rifles grow older or younger, but beneath it all lies the same truth. When humanity tries to build order from fear, it creates fortresses that protect the body and quietly starve the soul. When wandering through the ruins of this world, I often find myself drawn not to the armed checkpoints or the fortified bases, but to the places where people tried, desperately, beautifully, tragically, to build futures out of ideals. The collapse didn't just break nations, it exposed the human hunger for meaning. And in that hunger, two powerful movements rose from the dust: the Fireflies and the Seraphites. One carried the torch of freedom, the other held the whisper of faith. Both began with hope, and both slipped, in time, into something sharper. The Fireflies first appear in the records like sparks in the darkness, scattered uprisings across the country, unified by the belief that Fedra's oppression was not the final word. They painted their symbol on ruined walls, lit beacons in abandoned buildings, and spoke of restoring democracy, rebuilding society, and above all, finding a cure. For many survivors, the Firefly emblem meant possibility, a world where children might grow up without curfews, without soldiers pointing guns at their heads, without fear of being marched into a testing line. But ideals carry weight, and beneath the beauty of their mission lay something colder. The Fireflies pursued freedom with a kind of righteous intensity that made them willing to sacrifice anything, even the people they vowed to protect. I still remember the sterilized rooms of their hospital in Salt Lake City, the monitors still humming, the charts still hanging on the wall. Ellie was just a child with immunity, and to them, a key. She was never asked whether she wished to die for the world. The Fireflies decided for her. It is here that their contradiction becomes clear. They fought for liberty, yet placed the greater good above individual lives. Their rebellion promised a better world, but in the process, they adopted the same cold calculus that Phaedra used, just dressed in idealism instead of authority. Sometimes, freedom becomes its own kind of knife. Far from these medical halls and underground safe houses, another movement rose, quieter, older, shaped not by science or politics, but by longing for purity. The Seraphites, or Scars, withdrew from the remnants of modern civilization, embracing the teachings of a woman they called the Prophet. Her original message, preserved in fragments of scripture and humble carvings, urged calm, simplicity, and peace, a return to something uncorrupted. But when she died, her words fell into the hands of leaders who twisted them into commandments of fear. The Seraphites carved deep scars across their cheeks as signs of devotion, a ritual meant to sever themselves from the old world. They hung those they deemed contaminated by technology, believing suffering could cleanse the land. Their villages became places where silence ruled, a silence thick with reverence and dread. Walking through their forests, you might spot their symbols etched into trees, hear the rustle of bows drawn from the shadows, feel the tension of a people who view the modern world not as a memory, but as a disease. In their pursuit of purity, they became something uncanny, a kind of religious reflection of the infected themselves, silent, sudden, shaped by instinct and ritual. Both the Fireflies and the Seraphites dreamed of salvation. Both carved their paths with conviction, and in the end, both show the same truth. In a broken world, even hope can grow thorns. Some places in this broken world feel wounded, others feel abandoned, but there are a few, rare, terrible, that feel empty, as though humanity has been scraped out of them entirely. Santa Barbara is one of those places. When I first crossed its sun-blasted outskirts, I expected a coastline carved by time and ruin. Instead, I found something far more unsettling, signs of a group who had stepped past cruelty and into a realm beyond morality. They called themselves the Rattlers. The Rattlers emerged not with ideology or belief, but with an appetite. They were not trying to rebuild or reclaim or resist. They were simply indulging the last rotten impulses of a world that had already decayed. Their territory smelled of smoke and rust, and the air felt thick with something nameless. Not fear exactly, but the echo of it, like walking through a place where suffering had been repeated so often that it left a permanent stain. It didn't take long to understand their methods. Chains bolted into concrete, burn marks etched into the walls, piles of old restraints buried beneath sand and debris. These were not the tools of a faction trying to maintain order or enforce faith or search for a cure. They were instruments designed for domination, boredom, and cruelty. The Rattlers enslaved other survivors, treating them not as threats, not as enemies, but as toys. They beat people, burned them, hung them from rafters, not as punishment, not even as warning, but because it amused them. They even used infected like pets. We could remember seeing one of their makeshift holding pens, a cage fashioned from twisted rebar with a clicker chained inside. The creature jerked and spasmed against the metal, guided more by the fungus than by any memory of its former life. The Rattlers kept it there deliberately, a living alarm system. Other pens held runners, stripped of their humanity, but still capable of sensing movement. And it wasn't enough for the Rattlers merely to contain them. They deployed these infected like hunting dogs, releasing them into the night to flush out wanderers who ventured too close. It was a perverse ecosystem, predators using the infected as tools to create more terror. Standing in those places feels like staring into the empty shell of civilization. No laws, no purpose, no future, just cruelty circling itself, feeding on the last shreds of what people once were. In Fedra's strongholds, brutality was a means of control. In the Firefly's sanctuaries, sacrifice was justified by ideology. The WLF and Seraphites bled for land and belief. But here in the Rattler's domain, there was nothing, no cause, no dream, no justification, only the echo of human nature twisted past recognition. And it's in this contrast that a deeper truth emerges. The infected are predictable, driven by instinct, fungus, and hunger. But people can transform into anything the world demands of them. Fedra hardened into tyranny. The Fireflies slid toward fanatic sacrifice. Wellef and Seraphites waged endless war over visions of purity. And the Rattlers, they shed humanity entirely. In The Last of Us, the danger is not the cordyceps. The real terror lies in what humans become when the world stops holding them accountable. When you spend enough time moving through the silent neighborhoods and fungal caverns of this broken world, you begin to understand that the infection was never chaos. It has rules, quiet, patient, merciless rules. The mutated strain of cordyceps that first bloomed in 2013 is not a monster in the traditional sense. It is a system, a method, a slow rewriting of the human body into something it can use. The infection begins simply a bite, a scrape, a single breath in the wrong room. Cordyceps travels through the bloodstream like a whisper carried on a current, reaching the brain with unnerving speed. Once inside, it begins its work, silencing neural pathways one by one, replacing human instinct with fungal intent. Movement becomes jerky, then violent. Pain fades as nerve signals are overridden. The fungus strengthens the host's muscles while numbing its limits, turning the body into a vehicle that feels neither exhaustion nor fear. People often ask what remains of the infected in these early stages. A spark of memory? A trapped consciousness? I don't know. But sometimes, when I've stared into the trembling eyes of a newly turned runner, I've wondered if a tiny fragment of the person they were is still beating against the walls of their skull. The progression of the infection is terrifying, not because it is fast, but because it is so structured, almost ritualistic. Runners emerge within hours or days. They still resemble humans, twisted by panic, driven by instincts they no longer control. Their movements are frantic, unpredictable, guided by a hunger that has nothing to do with food. They feel like the last stage where the person inside might still be screaming. Weeks later, the fungus reshapes the host further, creating the stalker. These creatures cling to walls, hiding in half-lit corners, their bodies half overgrown, half human. They move with eerie patience, watching, waiting, choosing the perfect moment to strike. They are the ambushers of this world, the ones who remind you that silence is never safe. Months or years pass, and then come the clickers. By now, the fungus has burst through the skull entirely, blooming outward like a grotesque flower. They are blind, relying on echolocation, haunting clicks that reverberate through empty buildings like metallic heartbeats. Their bodies move with surprising precision, as if guided by something sharper than sight. A single brush of their hand can tear skin. A single misstep around them can end everything. The final stage, reached only after years of growth, is the bloater, lumbering, armored, almost mythic in its resilience. Layers of hardened fungal plates coat their bodies like stone. They move slowly but destroy anything they touch. Some survivors describe them as walking fortresses of decay. They are rare, but unforgettable. And beyond even these, evolution occasionally takes darker turns. Shamblers, swollen with acidic spores that dissolve flesh, hurl clouds of burning rot. And then there is the Rat King, a twisted fusion of multiple hosts, fused over a decade into one monstrous tapestry of limbs, bone, and memory. It is not a creature. It is an era condensed into a single nightmare. Cordyceps doesn't merely kill. It transforms, patient, deliberate, inevitable, a quiet reminder that nature does not need malice to be terrifying. As I move through the remnants of civilization, it becomes clear that cordyceps may have toppled governments, but it was human nature that reshaped the world afterward. Society didn't die in a single night. It splintered, hardened, and rearranged itself into fragments, each built around an idea strong enough to survive the collapse. And over time, these ideas sharpened into something far less forgiving. Every faction that rose from the ashes did so by clinging to a core belief. But when belief becomes a shield, it can just as easily become a blade. Fedra bound itself to the idea of order through control. Their motto was unspoken, but obvious: obey or perish. Curfews, public executions, rationed resources, each was a brick in the wall they built to keep chaos at bay. But the price of that wall was steep, and every citizen trapped inside it paid with a little piece of their humanity. The Fireflies were born as the opposite, a resistance, a spark of rebellion against tyranny. They carried banners of freedom, democracy, and hope for a cure, yet their devotion to the greater good pushed them towards sacrifice without hesitation. One child for the world, one life for the many. To them, the equation made sense until you looked into the eyes of the person being sacrificed. The WLF embraced strength. Their creed was carved into their weapons, and their training: we survive by eliminating threat. But strength requires an enemy, and the Seraphites, with their devotion to purity, became the perfect counterpart. Those two factions forged a conflict so relentless that generations may remember it as a war fought not for land, but for the right to define the future. The Seraphites themselves began with gentle teachings, a prophet preaching peace, simplicity, and quiet reverence. But after her death, her message was bent by leaders who needed control more than enlightenment. Their rituals hardened, their silence became a form of language, and violence turned into a sacred act of cleansing. They rejected technology as if it were poison, and in doing so, became a ghost of the world that once was. And then there were the Rattlers, the final distortion of human existence. No ideology, no dream, no structure, just predation. They're not a society. They're the absence of one. In this world, survival comes with an unwritten rule. If you want to live, you must belong. A lone traveler is rare and fragile. Without a faction, you risk becoming prey to bandits, slaves to the Rattlers, a target for zealots or simply another body in the dust. Strength in numbers has replaced moral choice. Communities value loyalty more than compassion, obedience more than empathy. And so the cycle turns. Fedra and the Fireflies clash over order and freedom. The WLF and Seraphites bleed over belief and territory. And wandering between these territories, I see that people run not only from the infected, they run from each other. This cycle of conflict is the true inheritance of the apocalypse. Humans build new worlds from the ruins, but they bring their old wounds with them. And so history repeats itself, not because we forget it, but because fear shapes us faster than hope ever can. If there is one truth that lingers in every ruined street, every abandoned home, every fungal cavern humming softly in the dark, it is this: The Last of Us is not a world of heroes. It is a world of choices. Heavy, imperfect, unavoidable choices made by people who no longer have the luxury of innocence. Out here, right and wrong do not exist as solid shapes. They leak, blur, dissolve into one another like ink dropped into water. Every action carries a reason, a fear, a wound, and every consequence ripples outward long after the person who made the choice is gone. Most cruelty in this world does not grow from hatred. It grows from terror, fear of losing someone you love, fear of being left behind, fear that if you don't strike first, someone else will take everything from you. These fears do not excuse the violence, but they explain it, the way storms explain fallen trees. I've seen people kill to protect a child who reminded them of someone lost. I've seen betrayals whispered through clenched teeth because starvation was only a day away. And I've seen the impossible, a man choosing the life of one girl over the entire human race. Joseph's choice, the choice that split the world in two. He was instead a hero. He was instead a villain. He was a man who had already buried a daughter and refused to bury another. And in that moment, his humanity outweighed the world's survival. Ellie's path is carved from another kind of fear, the fear that her life must have meaning because others died in her place. That guilt became the shadow walking beside her, shaping every decision she made. Her brutality was not born from evil, but from a desperate need to justify her existence. Abby, too, is woven into this pattern. Her vengeance feels monstrous until you peel back the layers and see the child who lost her father, a father killed by Joel's desperate act of love. Her violence mirrors Ellie's, a reflection cast from opposite sides of the same wound. No one in this world is wholly right. No one is wholly wrong. They are simply surviving. And in The Last of Us, survival is not a triumph. It is a negotiation, a constant, fragile bargaining between mercy and fear. This is what moral relativism looks like after the end of civilization. Not a philosophical debate, but a daily reality. People becoming soft or sharp depending on who they need to protect or who they need to bury. In the end, when I look across the factions, the ruins, the infected zones, I see only two kinds of people: those who have already died and those who are still trying to live long enough to regret the things they've done. Cordyceps did not invent cruelty. It merely unleashed a world where the consequences of fear had room to grow. The true horror of The Last of Us is not the infection. It is what desperation makes of us, one choice at a time. Before we continue, I want you to slow down with me just for a moment. This world, with its ruins, its fears, Its echoes of what once was can feel heavy. So let's move through it the way survivors once did, quietly, gently, one breath at a time. Inhale. Imagine you're stepping into an abandoned neighborhood, the kind where every window is broken, but light still slips through, turning the dust into golden rivers. Vines thread along brick walls, weaving themselves through shattered doorframes. Cordyceps curls across the pavement like roots searching for old memories. As you walk, the air thickens with the scent of earth, moss, and something faintly metallic, the smell of a world that is still healing, slowly, cautiously. Let that image fill your lungs, the soft amber glow, the fungal strands catching the dusk like embroidery. Hold. Stay here for a moment, suspended between breath and stillness. Feel the fragile quiet of a place where even breathing can be dangerous. Picture the particles drifting in the air, not quite dust, not quite light, suspended like tiny golden threads. This is a world where life and death balance on the same breeze, where every inhale is a reminder of how thin the boundary truly is. Let yourself feel that tension, not with fear, but with awareness. A world where silence protects you, where listening is survival, where stillness is strength. Exhale slowly. Release the weight in your shoulders. Let the ruins loosen their grip. As you breathe out, imagine the empty homes around you relaxing as well, beams softening, vines swaying gently as if sighing in relief. Let the memories of this place fade, like dust falling from a windowsill. The grief, the noise, the broken stories, all drifting away on your breath. What remains is only quiet. Quiet and the soft rhythm of your heartbeat, steady and warm amid the cold stone. Inhale again. This time, picture yourself moving through a narrow corridor overtaken by fungus. The walls pulse subtly with life, their textures layered like coral. Each step is cushioned by a soft quilt of moss, as if the world is trying to soften your path. Hear the distant tapping of loose cables, the distant chirp of night insects creeping back into territory once lost. You are not intruding, you are merely passing through. Hold, let the stillness wrap around you. You are in a place shaped by fear, yet filled with unexpected beauty, a paradox only this world can carry. Exhale and let go. Let the images dissolve, the spores drifting like lanterns, the trees reclaiming highways, the gentle sway of fungi claiming their quiet dominion. Let the world shrink to a soft hum, far away, but not forgotten. You are here now, breathing slowly, safe in the quiet between stories. As the last remnants of the journey settle, let your mind drift, softly, gently, into a place where decay becomes peace and silence becomes rest. In the end, the world of The Last of Us is not a story about the apocalypse. It is a story about the price we pay to hold on to something worth living for. Survival here is always braided with loss, and compassion, fragile, rare, easily broken, becomes the strongest force left standing. Thank you for turning these faded pages of humanity with me. If you hear the wind slipping through your window tonight, let it be a gentle echo from forgotten roads, where survivors still search for one another. Sleep softly, in a world where hope still blooms in the ash.